Right now, the global chocolate industry is worth roughly $230 billion a year. We eat it when we are happy, when we are heartbroken, when we need a gift and ran out of ideas. We have made it into bars, drinks, cakes, face masks, and at least one very questionable fondue fountain at every office party since 1994. But here is what almost nobody knows. The thing you are eating today would be completely unrecognizable to the people who invented it. What chocolate actually was, what it meant, what it cost, and what it took to get it into your hand. That is a story that will change the way you look at every single bar you ever open. The jungle origin, Mesoamerica, 3,500 years ago. The story of chocolate does not begin in a Swiss factory or a Belgian patisserie. It begins in a jungle. Specifically in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico and Central America, somewhere around 1,500 years before the Common Era, which is a long time ago even by the standards of things that have been around a long time. The Olmec civilization, one of the earliest complex societies in the Americas, was the first group of people we know of who figured out that the cacao tree was worth paying attention to. The cacao tree, Theobroma cacao, which translates from Greek as food of the gods, which is either very accurate or the most aggressive branding in botanical history, grows large yellow and orange pods directly out of its trunk. Inside those pods are seeds surrounded by a sweet, white, sticky pulp. Here's the thing about those seeds in their raw state. They are bitter. They are astringent. They taste the way a bad mood feels. Nobody looked at a raw cacao bean and thought, yes, this is going to become the thing humans love more than almost anything else on Earth. What they probably thought was, well, the pulp around it is quite nice. Let us see what happens if we ferment the whole pod. That is actually what archaeologists believe the earliest cacao use looked like. Not chocolate, not even close. Fermented cacao pulp, brewed into something closer to a fruity, slightly alcoholic drink. Chemical analysis of pottery vessels found at Olmec sites in the San Lorenzo region of Mexico has turned up traces of theobromine, a signature compound in cacao, dating back approximately 3,500 years. But the Olmec were onto something. Through fermentation, they discovered that the beans inside the pod, after drying and roasting, produced flavors that the fresh raw seed never hinted at. Roasting cacao beans unlocks hundreds of chemical compounds that simply do not exist in the raw material. The bitterness softens. Complexity emerges. You start to get something that smells, unmistakably, like the beginning of what we now recognize as chocolate. The Olmec left no written records, so we cannot know exactly what they thought about all of this. But we do know they passed the knowledge northward and onward, because the next civilization to get their hands on cacao took it somewhere extraordinary. The Maya, chocolate as religion. The Maya, who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas across present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, did not just drink cacao. They worshipped it. This is not a metaphor. The Maya had a god of cacao. His name was Ekchua, and he was associated with merchants and trade, which tells you something important about how seriously the Maya took the economics of the stuff. Cacao pods appear carved into Maya temples. They appear painted on ceramic vessels depicting royal ceremonies. They appear in burial sites, placed alongside the dead to sustain them in the afterlife. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya manuscripts, contains multiple references to cacao in ritual contexts and depicts gods consuming it. But what they were drinking was nothing like what you put in your mouth today. The Maya ground roasted cacao beans into a paste, mixed it with water, chili peppers, cornmeal, and various other spices, and then poured the liquid back and forth between two vessels from a height to create a thick, frothy foam on top. That foam was considered the most desirable part of the drink. It was bitter. It was spicy. It was served cold or at room temperature. There was no sugar in it, because the Maya did not use refined sugar. There was no milk in it. If you had handed this drink to a modern person with no context and asked them to guess what it was, the last answer on their list would probably be chocolate. But to the Maya, this drink, which they called cacao, was sacred. It was used in baptisms, in marriage ceremonies, in rituals that marked the transitions of life. It was so embedded in Maya spiritual life that the act of drinking cacao was, in certain contexts, understood as a direct participation in divine existence. The word chocolate, by the way, almost certainly comes from the Maya. The most widely accepted etymology traces it to the Yucatec Maya word xocolotl, which roughly translates to bitter water. So for the record, the people who invented chocolate named it bitter water, which is extremely honest and also a little sad. The Aztec Empire, liquid gold. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to dominance across central Mexico in the 1400s, cacao had become something it had never quite been before. Currency. Aztec merchants traded cacao beans the way we trade money. Archaeological records show that a small rabbit could be purchased for 30 cacao beans. A turkey egg cost 3. The services of a porter for a day cost 100 beans. Cacao was so valuable that counterfeiting became a problem. Archaeologists have found hollow cacao pods that were filled with dirt or avocado pits to pass off as real beans. Someone in the 1400s was out there running a cacao counterfeiting operation. I genuinely respect the commitment. The Aztec ruler Montezuma II reportedly kept warehouses stocked with nearly 1 billion cacao beans. That number is almost certainly an exaggeration passed down through Spanish accounts, but even discounted, the scale was enormous. These were literal vaults of money, except the money smelled incredible. The drink the Aztecs made from cacao was called xocolotl, and it was even more intense than the Maya version. They added vanilla, which they also cultivated, along with chili, flowers, and sometimes honey. It was consumed cold. It was consumed ceremonially, and according to the Spanish accounts that would arrive a few decades later, Montezuma himself drank it daily in vast quantities from golden cups, which were thrown away after a single use. And then, in 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived. Cortés and his soldiers were looking for gold. They found it. They also found an empire, a sophisticated agricultural system, extraordinary architecture, and a bitter, dark drink that the most powerful man in the Americas could not seem to get enough of. What did the Spanish make of all this? Mostly, they stole the gold. Some soldiers recorded observations about the cacao drink in letters home. A few described it with faint curiosity. Cortés himself mentioned it in dispatches, but spent considerably more time on the topic of silver mines. The Spanish conquistadors, who had just encountered one of the most consequential flavors in human history, were too busy dismantling a civilization to notice what they were sitting on. It would take another few decades before someone finally thought to bring cacao back to Europe. And when they did, Europe did not know what to do with it either. Chocolate crosses the Atlantic. Europe's confused reaction. Cacao arrived in Spain sometime in the mid-1500s. The exact date is debated. But by 1590 or so, the Spanish court was acquainted with the drink, and they did something that will either strike you as very smart or profoundly annoying depending on your personality. They kept it secret. For nearly a century, Spain largely sat on chocolate. They sweetened it, which was the first genuinely transformative thing any European had done to cacao. They served it hot instead of cold. They added cinnamon and vanilla and removed the chili. And they decided that this new version of the drink, warm, sweet, spiced, was too good to share with France and England. Spanish monks in monasteries adapted the preparation and refined it further, and the drink circulated within the court and the clergy for decades before the rest of Europe caught on. When chocolate did eventually reach France in the early 1600s, it arrived partly through the marriage of Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess, to King Louis XIII of France. She brought her chocolate habit with her, which is either a charming detail about love and comfort or the most significant act of diplomatic flavor transfer in European history. England got chocolate in the 1650s, and chocolate houses, which were essentially the coffee shops of their era, began opening across London. By 1690, there were dozens of them. They were places where men gathered to drink chocolate, read pamphlets, make business deals, and gossip. One of them, a chocolate house called Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley, eventually evolved into the London Stock Exchange. Which means that, in a sense, global financial markets grew out of a place where people sat around drinking hot chocolate. Make of that what you will. The Catholic Church, which had opinions about everything in the 16 and 1700s, got involved almost immediately. The question being debated, in complete seriousness, at the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority, was this: does drinking chocolate break a religious fast? The debate went on for over a century. Different bishops, cardinals, and theologians issued conflicting rulings. Some said it counted as food and broke the fast. Others said it was a drink and was fine. Pope Alexander VII, in 1666, reportedly declared that chocolate did not break a fast, which must have been an enormous relief to every chocolate-drinking Catholic in Europe. The official position of the Vatican on chocolate is something I did not expect to research today, and yet, here we are. By the mid-1600s, chocolate was the fashionable drink of the European aristocracy. It was expensive, it was exotic, and consuming it demonstrated that you had the disposable income and the cosmopolitan taste to do so. Exactly like the Maya elites who had done the same thing 1,000 years earlier, except the Europeans added sugar and thought they had invented something. Sugar, slavery, and the dark side of chocolate. There's no honest version of chocolate's history that does not spend time here. By the 1700s, European demand for chocolate was growing rapidly, and chocolate required cacao. Cacao required tropical conditions to grow. Tropical land was being seized and controlled by European colonial powers across the Caribbean, South America, and West Africa. And those plantations, every single one of them, required labor. The Spanish had already established cacao plantations in Mesoamerica during the 1600s, worked initially by indigenous people under the brutal encomienda system, a form of forced labor that was functionally indistinguishable from slavery in practice, if not always in name. When indigenous populations collapsed from disease and violence, enslaved Africans were brought in to replace them. By the 1700s, cacao cultivation had spread to the Caribbean islands and to the Portuguese colony of Brazil, and the labor systems that made it possible were identical to those driving sugar production in the same regions. The people who did the actual work of growing, harvesting, fermenting, and drying cacao beans were enslaved, owned, and disposable in the eyes of the colonial powers profiting from the industry. The European consumers who were filling their golden cups and their ceramic pots with hot chocolate were not, for the most part, thinking about this. The supply chain was long, the distance was great, and the price in the chocolate house only reflected the cost of a life at many, many removes. This was not accidental. Colonial trade systems were deliberately structured to make the origin of goods invisible to the people consuming them. The chocolate companies that would emerge in the 18 and 1900s inherited this system, and many of them did not examine it too closely. The question of who pays the true cost of chocolate and who profits from it did not begin in the 21st century. It has been embedded in cacao's story since the first European ship crossed the Atlantic with cacao beans in its hold. The Dutch press and the reinvention of chocolate. For most of its history in Europe, chocolate was a drink, a luxury drink, a fashionable drink, a ceremonially significant drink in the right context, but always a drink. The idea that chocolate could be something you bit into and chewed was not yet on the table. That changed in 1828 because of a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten and a machine he invented called the hydraulic cocoa press. Here is the problem Van Houten solved. When you grind roasted cacao beans into a paste, what you get is an intensely rich, intensely fatty substance because cacao beans are roughly 50% fat, known as cocoa butter. That fat is what makes the drink so rich and so difficult to mix cleanly with water. It is also what makes a bar of chocolate snap satisfyingly when you break it. But in the early 1800s, all of that fat was making the drink heavy, greasy, and inconsistent. Van Houten's press could squeeze most of the cocoa butter out of the ground cacao paste, leaving behind a dry, compressed cake. That cake could be ground into a fine, lean powder. Powder that dissolved in water far more easily than anything that had come before. Van Houten also treated his cocoa powder with alkaline salts, a process that became known as Dutching, which mellowed the bitterness, darkened the color, and produced the smooth, familiar flavor that most people today associate with cocoa powder. Suddenly, chocolate was cheap to produce and easy to use. The price dropped. The market expanded. Chocolate was no longer exclusively for people who could afford to buy it by the cup from a fashionable establishment. It was becoming something anyone could afford, which meant the next logical step was about to arrive. Someone was going to figure out how to make it solid. The birth of the chocolate bar. In 1847, a British company called J.S. Fry and Sons, based in Bristol, figured out how to combine cocoa powder, cocoa butter, and sugar into a paste that could be poured into a mold and allowed to harden. They called it chocolat délicieux à manger. Chocolate delicious to eat, which is a name so on the nose it almost loops back around to being brilliant. It was the first solid chocolate bar in history. The texture was grainy. The taste was quite bitter by modern standards. It would not win any awards at a contemporary chocolate festival. But it was edible. It was portable. It was novel. And it sold. Fry's went from being a respected chocolate drink company to being a pioneer of an entirely new product category in a single decade. Cadbury, another British company, followed closely behind with their own eating chocolate. The Cadbury brothers, Richard and John, were Quakers who believed that chocolate could serve as a moral alternative to alcohol, and they threw themselves into the business with the kind of sincere, slightly earnest energy that reads as charming from this distance. Cadbury's chocolate eventually became so successful that they built an entire model village outside Birmingham to house their workers. The village was called Bourneville, and it had parks, gardens, swimming pools, and notably no pubs, because the Cadburys had feelings about alcohol. But the moment that truly changed chocolate forever happened in Switzerland in 1875, and it happened because of a man named Daniel Peter, who spent 8 years trying to figure out how to add milk to chocolate and failing repeatedly. The problem with adding liquid milk to chocolate is moisture. Chocolate and water are enemies. Add liquid milk to chocolate, and you get a grainy, seized mess. Peter knew this. He tried anyway, for 8 years. His neighbor was a man named Henri Nestlé, who had recently figured out how to create condensed powdered milk by removing most of the moisture from milk while keeping the flavor. Peter borrowed some. He mixed Nestlé's powdered milk into his chocolate. It worked. Milk chocolate was born in 1875. It was smoother, sweeter, and milder than anything that had come before. It was also, almost immediately, enormously popular. Peter and Nestlé eventually merged their operations. The Nestlé company that exists today, one of the largest food corporations in the world, grew directly out of that moment when a man knocked on his neighbor's door and asked to borrow some powdered milk. History turns on stranger hinges than that, but not many. Hershey, the American chocolate empire, and the factory revolution Milton Hershey, was not the first person to make chocolate in America. But he was the first person to make chocolate in America at a scale that made it accessible to nearly every American. And those are two very different achievements. Hershey had already made a fortune in caramel when he attended the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and saw German chocolate-making machinery on display. He bought the equipment on the spot before the exhibition was even over. He had tried and failed at multiple businesses before caramel. He was not a man who waited around once he had an idea. By 1900, Hershey had sold his caramel company for $1 million, which he immediately poured into building a chocolate factory in rural Pennsylvania, on land near where he had grown up. Then he built a town around the factory. Streets, houses, a trolley system, parks, a school. The town was called Hershey because Milton Hershey was not a man burdened by false modesty. The genius of what Hershey did was not the chocolate itself. It was the economics. By using fresh local milk and investing in industrial-scale production, he could sell a Hershey bar for a nickel at a time when most chocolate was still relatively expensive. He democratized chocolate in America the same way Van Houten had democratized cocoa powder in Europe 50 years earlier. But here is the thing that still causes arguments on the internet to this day. American chocolate, specifically Hershey-style American chocolate, tastes different from European chocolate. Notably different. The reason is butyric acid, a compound that develops when milk is partially pre-processed before being added to the chocolate. Butyric acid gives American milk chocolate a faintly tangy, slightly sour, almost cheesy edge that most Europeans find puzzling, and most Americans find completely normal because they grew up with it. Neither side is wrong. They just grew up eating different things. The Hershey Kiss arrived in 1907. The Reese's Peanut Butter Cup came later in 1928. An entire American confectionery vocabulary was being built, piece by piece, out of that factory town in Pennsylvania. Chocolate, in wartime. The United States military has had a complicated relationship with chocolate since the Revolutionary War, when it was occasionally used as currency to pay soldiers. But the most remarkable chapter in the military history of chocolate involves a decision made in 1937, and it is one of those facts that sounds like a joke until you realize it absolutely is not. The United States Army approached Hershey's with a very specific brief. They needed an emergency ration bar for soldiers, a bar that provided 600 calories, a bar that could withstand temperatures of up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, a bar that weighed no more than 4 ounces, and critically, a bar that tasted just bad enough that soldiers would not eat it recreationally and save it only for genuine survival situations. Hershey's chief chemist, Sam Hinkle, developed the D ration bar, formerly known as Field Ration D. To hit the calorie density without making it too tempting, Hinkle made it extremely dense, almost granular in texture, and fortified it with oat flour. Soldiers described it variously as better than nothing, barely better than nothing, and a chocolate-flavored piece of chalk. The bar was designed to taste bad on purpose. The military commissioned 40 million of them. By the time World War II ended, Hershey's had produced over 3 billion ration bars for the Allied forces. That number includes a slightly improved version called the Tropical Bar, which tasted marginally better and was deployed in the Pacific. The fact that the improvement was considered noteworthy tells you something about where the baseline was. Chocolate also played a genuine morale role during the war. The British government, which had rationed nearly everything, maintained chocolate rations throughout the conflict because the psychological value of chocolate to soldiers and civilians under sustained stress was considered real and measurable. Winston Churchill, who also had strong opinions about tea, was apparently supportive of this position. The modern chocolate industry and its dirty secrets today. Roughly 70% of the world's cacao comes from West Africa, primarily from the Ivory Coast and Ghana. These two countries together supply more than half of all the cacao on Earth. The chocolate bars you find in every corner shop, every supermarket, every airport vending machine in the Western world almost certainly contain cacao from this region. And for decades, that cacao has been harvested in part by children. The International Labor Organization estimated in 2020 that approximately 1.5 million children were engaged in hazardous work in cacao farming in the Ivory Coast and Ghana alone. These are children doing work that involves wielding machetes, carrying heavy loads, and exposure to agricultural chemicals. Many of them are not attending school. Some are trafficked from neighboring countries. In 2001, the major chocolate companies, including Hershey, Mars, Nestlé, and Cadbury, signed something called the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary agreement pledging to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains by 2005. 2005 came and went. So did 2008 and 2010. Each deadline passed, new commitments were made, new deadlines were set, and the situation on the ground changed far less than the press releases suggested it had. A 2015 report funded in part by the U.S. Department of Labor found that child labor in Ivory Coast and Ghanaian cacao farming had actually increased since the protocol was signed. The companies have continued making commitments. The gap between those commitments and the reality of cacao farming remains enormous. This is not a distant historical injustice. It is happening right now in the supply chain of chocolate you can buy at any checkout line. The distance between the product and its origin has always been part of how the chocolate industry has operated. That distance is the thing the industry has never truly been willing to close. The dark chocolate renaissance and what we eat now. Here is the strange thing about where chocolate's story ends up. 3,500 years ago, cacao was a luxury consumed by elites who cared deeply about where it came from, how it was prepared, and what variety of bean was in the cup. Access to it was a signal of status. The preparation of it was practically a spiritual act. And then mass production happened. And for about a century, almost nobody thought about any of that. But something shifted in the early 2000s. Small producers started sourcing cacao directly from specific farms. They fermented and roasted and refined it themselves, on their own timelines, to their own specifications. They started calling it bean to bar and single origin, and they put the name of the farm on the packaging, alongside significant amounts of craft paper and very considered typography. A single bar from one of these producers might contain notes of dried cherry, tobacco, or jasmine, depending entirely on where the cacao grew and how long it spent in a fermentation box in a village somewhere in Ecuador or Madagascar. These bars cost $10, $12, $15 for something roughly the size of your hand. And people buy them. Which means that in 2025, the highest-end chocolate in the world is consumed in almost exactly the same spirit it was consumed in a Maya court 1,500 years ago. Slowly, deliberately, with attention to origin and craft and meaning. The wheel has completed a full rotation and landed in a Brooklyn tasting room. As for whether chocolate is actually good for you, because someone in the comments is always going to ask, the honest answer is, sort of, maybe, with significant asterisks. Cacao contains flavanols, compounds linked in various studies to cardiovascular benefits and reduced inflammation. Dark chocolate has more of them than milk chocolate. Some research suggests real benefits from regular small amounts. But those studies are frequently small, frequently funded by the chocolate industry, and almost never conducted on the chocolate most people are actually eating. The science applies to 85% single-origin dark chocolate consumed in careful portions. It does not apply, at least not in the same way, to a family-sized bag of something with a caramel layer watched over a Tuesday evening streaming session, which, again, is not a judgment. That is just also part of what chocolate is now. Cacao started as a fermented jungle fruit in an Olmec village. It became sacred, then currency, then a colonial commodity, then an industrial product, then a global obsession, then a craft movement, and then simultaneously all of those things at once. From bitter water to every vending machine on the planet. Through religion, empire, slavery, industry, and a military chemist who was specifically asked to make it taste worse. It is not ordinary. It never was. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of this story surprised you most. There's a lot more coming.